Anderson, owner of Downtown Books. So we're not going to talk long because you're not here to see me. But this is our inaugural author event at this beautiful new College of Albemarle Dare campus. And we're presenting tonight with COA Dare as well as the Pea Island Preservation Society. So it's a collaboration that we're very excited about and looking forward to more down the future. So thanks very much to COA for being so excited and enthusiastic about getting together with us on partnerships like this. And we're actually Zooming this, and then it will be recorded for later. So it gives us all kinds of new technology that I'm completely incapable of doing. So very pleased to welcome David Wright Falade tonight. And he's written the definitive history, of course, on Pea Island lifesavers and Richard Etheridge, Fire on the Beach, which I still order by the case from Oxford University Press. If yes, it does still sell. He has a previous novel, Away Running, and then his new novel about the Civil War years of Richard Etheridge, Black Cloud Rising, which just when published as an excerpt in the New Yorker, made my phone ringing, because everybody wanted that book. I'm like, isn't that even a book yet? But when it is a book, buy it. And people are. It's currently in the top 6 books at our store. We've got a lot of great local books and local writers, local history, and he's right up there. Probably after tonight, you're going to be about number 3. So selling well. We're so excited that he undertook this mission to share this story and this piece of history from Roanoke Island and the Outer Banks and Tidewater. And I'm going to let him take it from there. Thank you again.
Can everybody hear me okay? My voice usually varies, but yeah. All right. So what I'd like to do is, like I'd always rather be in conversation. Like I just don't feel comfortable just talking at y'all. So I thought I'd read a little bit from the novel. And I was going back and forth. I was just talking with Daryl Frank Christel, why don't I? But I also have just a very short piece of thoughts that occurred to me that are pertinent, I think. So I'll read that too. And then afterwards, I just really would love to ask questions and just have a conversation. All right. So Black Cloud Rising came out in February. I was going to read a little bit from the first chapter. I guess that's context. So the novel tells the story of Richard Etheridge when he's in the Civil War, when he first joined what would become the 36th United States Colored Troops. They were familiarly called the African Brigade. And before they set off on when he first joins, they're not getting arms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Their leader, General Edward Augustus Wild, from Brookline, Massachusetts, this sort of rabid, passionate, zealot abolitionist, wants to arm these men and wants to get them in the field. When he first gets them arms, he takes them on this short foray out of Fortress Monroe, up in Tidewater, to arrest a Confederate or a plantation owner who's suspected of being a rebel guerrilla. So I'm just going to read from that section. It was an Indian summer morn. Yellowjacks like we had out in sandbanks rousing alongside the day's heat, petulant and unrelenting, gliding onto whatever skin lay exposed, your cheek, the nape of your neck. And like back home, they bit down to let you know that they'd stopped by, as though the buzzing at your ears hadn't already done that. Troopers swatted at the air despite Sergeant Revere's scornful gaze. I strove not to maintain the same air of authority. The distraction ceased as we parade marched past the Princess Anne Courthouse. Old Glory whipped back and forth on her staff atop the white stone building, though it was clear that she was begrudgingly flown. I silenced my up-twos, but each and every one of the men kept a steady beat all the same, even unsure Simon Gaylord. Our footfalls had the cadent boom of thunder. Whatever citizen, loyal or not, had not yet learned of our landing surely did so then. We'd hardly gone 200 yards past the courthouse when the Claxton farm appeared, Across a stretch of unflowered and rustling stems were flax that not so long before been harvested. Cuffy, the runaway, finger pointed it out. General Wild raised the one good arm and our column halted, the booming footfalls of a sudden still. Though nary a head turned, all eyes peeked as one over at the plantation house across the way that was our target. It was more facade than depth, boasting tall windows and a terrace out front, but just dull planking on the sides, with little texture and no paint. A weatherboard barn stood to the left, a mess of chattel houses to the right. The general had yet to speak word but first. He turned his mount and trotted back down our line, casual-like. Coming abreast of each row, he seemed to take in each man. As he neared me, I noticed that a yellowjack, furry and full, had lit upon his face, above the right eye. The man did not flinch as the deerfly did his due. Wild met my gaze full on. "No need fight the inevitable," said he. "Let come what may, the pain cannot last." And he sauntered on. Some minutes later, I heard General Wild spur his mount, and man and rider dashed to the head of the company. He ordered us forward, Bacchus' squad on one flank, Revere's on the other, where the chattel houses were, and mine down the center, straight through the crackling flats. The three lines spanned a half circle around the main dwelling house. Slaves stirred. Some emerged from the barn to take a look-see, even more from the chattel houses, which weren't but shacks with uneven joints and unglassed slits for ventilation. Then, a man with disarranged hair and considerable whiskers appeared at the door of the main house. Clapson, for sure, for he carried himself as though proprietorship was his established to do. He wore breeches and a long-sleeved undershirt, nothing more, his suspenders not yet raised over his shoulders, and he stepped out onto the broad porch and stared down the general, who had ridden in front of him and not dismounted. Aught other moved. My squad being nearest, I had a box seat view when the general finally spoke. "Edgar Clapson?" he queried. "You know damn well it is," said the other. "I am Edward Augustus Wild, Brigadier General Volunteers, commanding." He half turned in the saddle and added with a flourish, "The African Brigade." We all just stood there at attention. "I see your nigger ponies," said Clapson, "and I do not recognize your authority." He hitched up the suspenders, an angry gesture, as though they too had vexed his peaceful waiting. "I commanded Tidewater 12th Home Guard, the Pungo Raiders, and this here is my property." Wild signaled with a nod, and Revere, who was nearby, flew up onto the porch in 2 quick strides and seized Clapson meanly by the shirt and by the nape. "Unhand me," said Clapson. 2 troopers joined Revere, and they forced the man down the steps and wrestled him to his knees, beneath the general's gaze. "Pogies, sir?" Wild said. "Did you say pogies?" Clapson would not respond. So General Wild continued. These men are Armageddon's agents, both Gog and Magog. Your world is no more." He turned toward us, the rest of the company. His voice boomed. "Guerrillas are cowards and murderers, without honor, no better than land pirates, and their fate is either quarantine or death. This land pirate's property is hereby confiscated. Seize all men, women, and tykes. Seize the grain and any implements and tools. Fill every hogshead, fill every buckboard. It is all contraband and it returns with us." I broke the men into teams and sent this one toward the barn and that one toward the chattel houses, where slaves were still falling out. And what had been puzzlement and gloom now turned to pure rejoicing. I could not know whether my own face showed it, but I was much overjoyed too. I was directing some men loading a handcart with farm tools when I overheard the runaway Cuffy say to the general, "All slaves buck their legs." His head was bowed, but his voice clear and strong. But this one, he in the habit of stripping them head to heels, gals as likely as men's, whatever the age and for the least offense, and he laid it on sportly. The general's expression did not change, but something was moving underneath. "I know at least one that ain't survived it," said Cuffy. And I noted then what aforehand I had failed to see. A whipping post, well used, standing erect between the dwelling house and the barn. Or, what was more likely, my eyes had until then dodged seeing it. I had never suffered the lash, for what slave did not know it? General Wild, come abreast of Clapson, still disdainful of dismounting, leaned low from the saddle. Even the women, said he. Even the women? Revere yanked Clapson to his feet, unbidden by the general, but the order clear. The Secesh pulled like a colt then, knowing certain what was next. Revere, with a fistful of hair and a fistful of cloth, dragged him toward that upright timber. Shackles hung from its foretop point, and while two troopers wrestled the man's lurching and writhing, Revere hitched him on by the wrists. The yard was dead still, us colored, slave as well as soldier, watching on. Mrs. Clapson's mouth lay wide open, lips a quiver, but no sound came forth. There were 3 little boys, though, each one wailed. The general marched his mount to the barn and into it, then returned with a bullwhip over the pommel of the saddle. He rode it over to Revere. Clapson yanked at his wrist, crying to be released, all plea and no protest now. Pungo Raiders, said the general. Top point. And with this, Revere, again obliging some unspoken command, lit the air with that long leather hide. Once, and again. Fields Mitchell was then beside me, and I had not heard him come up. Damn, Richard said. Damn. It was neither pity nor pleasure in his voice, just blunt astonishment. For who among us could have imagined this? The bottom rail on top, a nigger flogging an illegal white man. The general bid Revere to stop just 4 lashes along. Clapson's head slumped low, his lips whispering curses. The general prepared to address us troopers gathered around, or so we initially thought. In fact, he was speaking at them others. Ladies, said he, his voice musical with sympathetic timbre, I won't ask that you disclose this man's blasphemies against your virtue. Instead, I present the chance to settle old scores. The yard stood still. Even Clapson's sons had ceased to wail. From the crowd emerged an old man, head wrapped in a red rag, cheekbones like straight razors, a burlap dress hanging as long and plumb as her own long self. She crossed to the post, a deliberate stride that made the 30-odd paces seem a damn sight more distant. When she got there, she unfastened the tie, and the topmost burlap dropped to the waist. Dogs as flat as griddle cakes lay like sad folds of flesh against her chest. It did seem she retained a tooth in her head. This here the only virtue of being a Clapson nigger, said she, her voice graphic and as purposeful as her movements. She turned, and her back was a tangle of fleshy welts. Ain't out here left to blaspheme, but I expect I might take you up on that scorn bit. As Clap's come up as long, dude. The general took the coil of cowhide from Revere and handed it to the old man. She let it out along the ground, reckoning the proper distance. Once she settled onto the right spot, the cowhide sang. And then I heard the rest, the other slaves cheering, troopers too. I heard Mrs. Clapson's rejoined wailing, her children's, and the rebel Clapson begging, mercy, Jenny, oh mercy. Revere stood so near Clapson that I thought the cowhide's lip might cinch his cheek. His lips just off Clapson's right ear, he whispered the man with each wallow, roughly, for sure, given Revere's dread aspects. Vengeance can be justice, well earned and meted out fairly, and yet be vengeance all the same. The cowhide sang. I'll stop there. And this other piece is, I was in Vermont a week or so ago, and in a similar setting, we were having a conversation, and just some of the questions struck me. So I jotted down some notes and worked them into a rough form. So I just wanted to read a little bit about this sort of reflection. During a public event last week in Manchester, Vermont, on a bit of a whim, I read from the first pages of Black Cloud Rising, not what I just read, but the actual very opening. Something I'd never done before. I usually read from the section I just read to you, describing the regiment's foray into the field to arrest the rebel guerrilla captain, which involves a dramatic flogging. The bottom rail on top, as one of the novel's Black Trooper says. The pages I read from in Vermont are the memory of the novel's protagonist, Richard Etheridge, ones that he has of his youth. The scene shows his conflicted relationship with his white father and white near brother. People whose approval and love he seeks, even as he recognizes that his place in the societal hierarchy as a slave is below them, even as he understands, in fact, that he belongs to them. After the Vermont reading, I realized that, while impromptu, the choice of sections to read also rose from this deep-set feeling that has been nagging at me since the publication of the novel in February. The reviews of the book, which, thank God, have been largely positive, fairly unfailingly describe Black Cloud Rising as a Civil War novel. And it is that. It's that for sure. But in conceiving and writing it, I also imagined it altogether differently. For me, at heart, it's a story about family, in the particular sense of Richard's family, of his complicated paternity, but also in the broader sense. Black Cloud Rising is about our larger American family. This latter interrogation is what I want to speak to you all briefly about today, as it was the motor of driving me as I wrote the book. I published an excerpt from Black Cloud Rising in the New Yorker in 2020, in advance of having even placed the novel with a publishing house. The piece brings together the parts of the narrative that reveal Richard's backstory, a slave child of his master who, with emancipation nearing, struggles to come to terms with his relationship to the white family. In an interview with an editor of the magazine that was published online, she made the connection between that story and my own. She remarked that Richard's story, on some level, mirrored my own, given my own family history. And she was right. And how had I not recognized it before? I'm the child of a Holocaust survivor and an African from the French colonies, the grandson of the last slave trading king of Dahomey. They were young when they met, and it was post-World War II Paris. And because of those things, they behaved like young people in tumultuous times. As a result, I was raised by a Black GI from Jim Crow, Kansas City. These three had come together in a strange love triangle that I'm exploring in my new novel. So yes, the inquiry at the heart of Richard's story resembles, at least on some level, mine. Ultimately, it's an exploration of Americanness, of the lush, though fraught, hybridity at the center of who we all are as a people. Richard's and my stories tend toward the big drama that makes for a good novel. Our stories aren't atypical, though. During a speech in response to the controversy surrounding Reverend Jeremiah Wright, Barack Obama described his Kenyan father and white Kansan mother and the people, quote, of every race and every hue, scattered across 3 continents who comprise his family, concluding that in no other country on earth is his story even possible. Our stories are the American story. Americanness is, by definition, being the product of more than one something. Slaves and indentured servants, Christian and Jews, bankers' sons and the daughters of the family maid. The steady stream of immigrants, regardless of their ethnicities, all of them have made babies together. With that said, from the start, even before the founding, from 1619, when the first slaves arrived on our shores, the original mixing, the original source of conflict, has been about Black and white. Though race in the United States is not a fiction, it is pure invention. The racial categories of quote-unquote Black and quote-unquote white, created to justify the unjustifiable, slavery, are fabricated. The twin notions of Blackness and whiteness rely upon one another. Blacks, Americans of African descent, might be local, born here in North Carolina or on Jersey's North Shore, but according to the fiction of race, their lineage remains irredeemably elsewhere, from Africa, from a land of savages. Whites, on the other hand, are the opposite. To be white, regardless of one's specific ethnic origins, English, Irish, Italian, or whatever, is understood as being not Black. To be white in America is to not be black. Yet this notion of our American racial identity, while wholly contrived, is pervasive still today. If America, the modern ideal of multicultural democracy, has succeeded in continuing forward, however stubbornly, it's because despite the founders' narrow conception of our national identity, they embrace an expansive definition of individual rights. And while the founders could have never imagined someone like me aspiring to the rights for which they militated for themselves alone, their ideas have matured and now encompass more, including me. Life in a modernizing world thrives on, depends upon even, this sort of evolution, on mixing, on reinvention, and the progress that ensues. It's a messy process. That messy process is where I'm trying to make sense of it in Black Cloud Rising. Those were my thoughts. A little jumbled, so I apologize. So I would love to have a conversation as opposed to me just continuing to yak, y'all. I was hoping that was a hand.
When and where did you hear about the story of Richard Etheridge, and how did you come about deciding to write a book?
You know, so Fire on the Beach, my first book that I co-wrote with David Zobie, it was really Zobie. Zobie's from Newport News, and he had spent with his family growing up. He'd spent time out here. He's a little younger than me. I'm 58, so we were talking about, you know, he's growing up in the 70s, coming down and whatever. And then as he's in college in the 80s, he's working out on the beach. But he was living in Collington in a trailer without air conditioning, and he knew that they had AC over at the aquarium. So he went to the aquarium, and Mr. Melvin's paintings were there. Mr. Melvin's right. Mr. Melvin's paintings were there. And so he was like, what's this? Fast forward a couple, so it stuck him. Like, he knew the lore of the lifesaving service out here, but he didn't know that there was a black crew. And fast forward a couple of years, he came to, we were first year students together at Virginia Commonwealth University. And like all first year grad students, we were disgruntled and, you know, yeah, just unhappy. And we were at a very stereotypical sort of creative writing program party where somebody at some point pulled out a guitar, and, you know, and we're just sitting there, you know, I had hair, pulling my hair out. And Zoe asked me if I'd ever heard of Piano, and Piano Lifesavers. And at that point, I just come back from living abroad. I didn't even know where the Outer Banks was. And he showed me the picture that's on the cover of the book. And it's striking. I mean, I didn't know anything about the lifesaving service, but it's striking, right? And Richard Etheridge is striking in that picture. And we did a little bit of research, and we came across David Stick's books, and he mentions them in both of his books. You know, a few paragraphs, and he talks about Captain Dick Etheridge. And so it just struck me, what little I knew that a black station after the Reconstruction in the segregated South, I just was trying to put all that together, and I wasn't quite sure how. And then we went to the Coast Guard first, and the Coast Guard, I mean, they have better things to do than to research their history, although they have a historian. So we got a little bit from them, but not a ton. He was a commander, he retired admiral. Stephen Rashawn was doing some research, and so we exchanged notes with him. But then we wrote a letter to the Outer Banks History Center and got a 3-page single-spaced letter from Wendell, who's here now, telling us about just the interest in the story, documents that were there, and just the energy and what was at the Outer Banks History Center was already beginning to sort of raise new questions. And it just started that way. It really began, Zoe and I thought we'd write something for grad school. We came down, we met Wynn. He further sort of, you know, sparked the fire in us. It went from something we write for grad school becoming an article that we published in the Journal of Negro History. I was reading a lot of history, so I thought Negro history. And eventually it just became a book. So fair warning, I am totally a rambler. And I also speak in digressions. So most questions at your own risk. I'm gonna be all over the place. So
yeah, how do you come up with the title of this from Black Cloud Rising? I like that title.
Yeah. So the original title, which I knew wouldn't fly, but I hoped would fly. And I apologize for some of the language I use. It's tough, but one of the things that interested me, so General Wild is this important figure in the book. He's this one-armed general. white firebrand abolitionists from the North. And one of the things that, as I was sort of hearing voices of the soldiers talking, imagining the plot, one of the sort of through lines of the plot was these men, these Black soldiers, really embracing General Wild as one of theirs. And so they would refer to him as that nigga Wild. And so the original title was That Nigga Wild. You know, because it's a play on that word on one end, on word, and they're referring to a white man, but also on the fact, like Edward Augustus Wild is the most appropriately named person ever. You know, before the Civil War, he goes off and he's involved in the Crimean War, right? He's a medical training, he's a doctor by training, but he goes abroad and he's, you know, joins the forces of Omar Pasha and, you know, fights, I guess technically not, but he's a doctor in their service. He comes back and as an abolitionist, he raises a white regiment first. They go down south. He's wounded in one arm at Bull Run, so it's fairly incapacitated. Goes back north, recovers, rejoins his unit at South Mountain. He loses the other arm. Right, but that's not enough. He can't lead this group anymore, so then he goes south and he's raising these Black regiments. So he's a zealot. He's passionate about what he believes in. He's a zealot. So I thought those play on words were interesting. And then as it wore out, they're like, no, that's not going to be the time. My agent was like, can you imagine that in Walmart? And I was like, so struggling forever. And I'm very fortunate to have just a wonderful editor. It's Morgan Entrican who edited. This is going to sound weird because it sounds really different, but he edited Cold Mountain. He's the one who found Charles Fraser, edited Cold Mountain, but he also edited Sex and the City, right? But it's just this editor who has, you know, and he was, we were sort of going, well, what can the title be? And he was like, go back to Civil War songs. And in the front of the novel, I have an epigraph from this Civil War song that was written by a white Northerner, but about Black troops. So it was a person who was sympathetic to the Black troops, but he writes it in dialect. And at one point, he refers to the black cloud, this mass of men, Black men, as this black cloud rising. I told you I had really long with it. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, have you been approached for movie opportunities, and do you see this evolving into a movie scenario?
I would love for that to happen. And I mean, I think everybody would, you know what I mean? So I would love for that to happen. And that same question came up a week ago, and I felt sort of, I was a little superstitious. So like, there have been conversations, but this is true now, so I can say it aloud. Tyler Perry's production company is Options Alliance. You know, like the option so means they're interested, but you know, maybe it just sits there forever. So yeah. So I hopefully. Yeah. In my mind, I'm already casting people. Yeah. It will not mess my opinion.
What kind of research did you do for the language? Because, you know, it's very authentic,
Yeah.
very,
Thank you.
you know, in 1800s, and it's so consistent. I mean, how did you do it?
Thank you. Yeah. It's my previous novel, Away Running, came out, and it had its own sort of difficult serpentine path to publication. And I've had the story of Black Cloud Rising in the back of my head since Fire on the Beach. But it wasn't clear to me that that's where I was going to go back to. But the novel I'm trying to finish now, that I think I will finish. Actually, I had a previous draft that I thought was done about, you know, this sort of love triangle in post-war Paris. And I'd finished Away Running, and I thought I'd finished that. And my agent at the time circulated it to the publishing houses, and everybody rejected it. So I was a little dejected, not sure what I was going to do. And I remembered the story of this, you know, 3-week foray up to Elizabeth City and back. And Richard Etheridge has always stuck with me. And the Outer Banks, I mean, I'm from Texas, I'm not an Outer Banker, honorary if I'm lucky, but so I remember I was in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities were doing a book tour thing with the way running. And I woke up one morning and the first few paragraphs came out almost exactly like they are. Like I just heard the voice. I saw the scene and I heard the voice. And I think part of that is because, like I remember when I first came down here with Zoe in 1993, at the bookstore where y'all were at, there's a book I'm sure still exists. And like I was puzzling out the words on the title, I never made sense of it. It was HOITOID. And I was like, oh, high tide on the Outer Banks. And I would hear people, older bankers speak. I grew up in Texas, which has its own particular accent. I've been all over the South, and I've heard a Southern accent, and it's Southern, but it's not, it's something else. And hearing the rhythms, well, hearing what I would call an accent, for lack of a better word, but then also like speaking to like Mr. Collins, Herb Collins, speaking to Mr. Bowser, Theodore Beacon's son, Nicholas Beacons was still alive, speaking to elderly Black bankers in the 90s who were still alive. So it was the rhythms of the language, but also Black vernacular English. So there was something super specific that that was just always in there. But the other piece of it, Bill, you were mentioning the letter. No, it wasn't Bill, it was another person who was mentioning the letter earlier that Richard Etheridge sent from outside Richmond. This letter he sent about the treatment of Blacks on the road of God when he was in the Civil War. And the voice isn't the exact same, but there are these cadences. So it was kind of a marriage of all those things. I'm glad it reads as authentic. It pleases me to know and to be out here, it reads as authentic, because if you're not from here, I think people can go, oh, that's interesting, that's distinctive. My fear was that like y'all would go, hey, that's interesting, but that's not authentic. But I was trying to capture not just the Outer Banks language, way of speaking, but also the way that that's also inflected by Black vernacular English. You know, the sort of the way that can be lyrical at times, you know. So yeah.
A friend who's an author says that her character begins speaking to her.
Yeah.
Who in this novel speaks to you and speaks the most?
Richard and Revere. Okay. Yeah. Richard Etheridge, you know, in his 58 years, had such a packed, full, rich life. There's another novel to write about Richard Etheridge, just his experience after the Civil War, which is, you know, interesting. So Richard Etheridge as a figure, tried to cover him as best we could in Fire on the Beach, but as a former slave, as an African American in that era, there's just a lot we had to speculate about. That we could sort of go, it seems to be pointing to this, but we couldn't prove it. In fiction, I can sort of go, I'm going to take it as an assumption. So Richard Etheridge was a big part of that. But Revere also, all the characters in the book are actual figures. For them, you know, again, I'm a fiction writer. I'm taking license. I'm imagining their histories. I'm trying to inform what I know about them. Colonel Draper, letters I read from them, Richard Etheridge, obviously, Fields mentioned. I'm trying to imagine who they might have been from what I think I know from Fire on the Beach, but they're actual figures. Revere, I made a whole cloth. And in part, because I needed the sort of photo negative of Richard. Biracial, but not at all conflicted, right? Richard's conflicted. He wants his father's approval. Revere is not conflicted. And so I made up Revere, and I think maybe in part because I wanted him to be the photo negative image of Richard. His voice was there a lot too. Whenever they were in the room together, I could do them. Yeah. I have a friend who speaks that way though, and talks about like the character speaking to him, and a part of me just like wants to resist it. Like it's true, like you know, when I'm in my room alone, but I hate to say it aloud, it makes you sound, you know, schizophrenic. You know, so, but yeah, it's true. There was a hand coming up before. Were you can ask a question?
I was gonna ask you, in the letter that you read, you connect Richard to your own experience.
Yeah.
And then you also said you're writing now.
Yes.
About that experience. Who speaks to you when you're writing now?
I'll tell you who doesn't. So it's this love triangle between, and I'm fictionalizing it, it's really departing from what I know of my family, which is what it needed to do. But from the beginning, even when I was sort of channeling, I was really, again, I speak in digression, so I'm going to apologize ahead of time, so I'm going to go on a little bit of a digression. When I lived abroad in France, after graduating, my mom was a French Jew. And we lived in the United States. I was born in France. We lived in the United States my whole coming up, in Kansas City for a while, and then we were down in Oklahoma and then Texas. My Wright was military, and then she married another man, Wheeler, who was also military. But when I started beginning to learn, I didn't learn about my African paternity until I was 16. And then after college, Chris and I went to college together. After college, I lived abroad in France, and I got to know my grandmother. I met her a few times, she'd come visit. And she was my mom's mom. She was just awesome. But she was also a graphologist. And so she studied handwriting in this sort of scientific way, pseudoscience, one might call it. But I mean, she was hired by law firms. Like in France at that time, when you wrote a letter of application, you handwrote it, your CV and things like that. And they were hired graphologists to analyze the handwriting. So she did that, and we would talk, she'd tell me stories, and I'd show her a letter from the woman I was seeing, and she would do this analysis and whatever. But then at one point, we were talking about my mom. I also had tons of questions, and she was like, she pulled out this letter that my mom had written her, and then I came to understand that she had several letters, and it turns out that she had all the letters that my mom had sent her, a few from when my mom was a kid. But my mom left France in '57, and all the letters from '57 until about the mid-'80s, when their correspondence started tapering off, and she gave them to me. So I had this 30 years worth of letters, and it ended up being a blessing and a curse. So I was imagining the two fathers, my African father, and then Wright, who I thought was my father. Those two characters just spoke to me. In fact, Wright's voice was like Richard's voice in a way, like it just comes off the page. My mom, I could not pin it down. I did, I wrote it, and I rewrote it. But that was why the novel failed in 2016. So that was the voice that wasn't speaking to me. And if I'm lucky with this rewriting I'm doing, in part because I'm departing now from what is their story and just manipulating it as I need to so that it reads well, hopefully. So to answer your question, both of my father's voices, I don't even know why, but they were clear, they came off, and those characters are complex. But my mom, I guess maybe I idealize her too much or something.
Can I follow up?
Of course, yeah.
So when you are Fire on the Beach, you're David Wright.
Yes.
And when you're Black Cloud Rising, you're David Wright.
Falade. Yeah.
Wow.
So I'm gonna knock on wood some more. I was just some weird. That's nice. Okay. So, as I've been writing this novel, I'm in New York this year. I'm a fellow at the New York Library, and we have to do these presentations. And I was speaking, and some of the questions that came back from the audience really helped me understand how I was failing in this novel. And some of it had to do with what I was saying. I was going by Falade already at that point. But what I realized from that was, initially I took the name Falade. My mother died in 2016, and Falade died in 2019. And when he died, right before he died, I took his name on. But I ended up writing this is super aggressive. I ended up writing this essay that's circulating. Hopefully somebody will want to publish it. But it was about this specifically, which is to say, I think it's as much to honor my mother, which is to say, so she had this affair with this man who had been her first love after she was married to Wright. This was in the early 60s. But because it was an affair, she got pregnant, and Falade, who was not honorable in that situation, acknowledged that I was his son, but just sort of divorced himself from it. He was descended from the slave trading dynasty. And so he's afraid his father or whatever, image of this. So anyway, he's not a hero in the story. My mother kept it a secret until I was 16, and she told me a little bit because she was a little bit forced. Like my stepfather knew, and they were going to divorce, and so he was threatening to tell me. So she told me, And I reached out to Falade and said, hey, I know, I was asking nothing, I was just sort of, hey, I know. And he was very distant, his family still didn't know. I'm saying all that as a way to say, we had this really conflicted relationship. And when I'm living in France with my grandmother, and things like that, it wasn't to get to know him, but I ended up beginning to get to know him. And over time, we got to be really close. And what I realized is the thing that my mother would have most wanted was for me to be a Falade. She, you know, so Max Falade, my father, was the first Black architect from West Africa, right? He got into, he and two older sisters were sent to France to get an education before World War II, and then the war happened, and they were completely isolated and separated, and they stayed in France. He never got to finish his high school degree. Despite that, he prepared on his own and got into Beaux-Arts, you know, the Institute of Beaux-Arts, right? And then he becomes the first Black, I mean, he's distinguished. His older sister, with whom he's there in France, is the first Black woman psychoanalyst, right? She's a protege of Jacques Lacan. She's a protege also of this guy named Robert Debray. I didn't know anything about it, but he was like sort of one of the sort of, not founding fathers, but he was an important person in pediatric medicine. These are these distinguished people, right? My mom, who was, you know, French Jew from this sort of fairly, you know, as a family before the war, they lost everything during the war, including a lot of family members. And she just embraced, I got her Communist Party card. She embraced anti-colonialism and things like that. And she was like, these were her people. And when it broke up, she was sort of riven from that. And she sort of married this black guy, and she's suddenly in the United States before leaving Virginia. And life is tough. And so she always idealized the Falades. And when she had this affair and then had me, I think she always wished that I were a Falade. And so to take his name felt like it was as much honoring her as him, right? Long-winded answer too, sorry. And I'm all like, my younger was like, this become like a selling out Jesse Raphael or whatever.
Sounds like you started.
Hmm.
Sounds like you started.
Yeah, I actually have from that essay. Yeah.
So do you have any kind of relationship with your stepfather still? Or not?
Everybody died.
Oh,
Everybody died. My Wright died relatively young. He was totally, his voice was easy to hear because he was funny and charming and charismatic, but he was also a little bit irresponsible. You know, he grew up poor in poor Kansas City, Jim Crow era, you know, and so he basically drank himself to death. He died right after we finished at Carleton. I was 22. My stepfather, the man who threatened to tell me, he and my mom eventually split up, and he died maybe 10 years later. So they all passed. Yeah. My mom in 16 and then Father in 19. Yeah.
As you researched, did you go back into Richard's childhood? You mentioned the conflict between his father. Did you?
I tried. That was the really hard part. Richard Etheridge was a slave. When we first started doing the research, that was less out there. It was, you know, he was often described as having been free, but we figured out fairly quickly he was a slave. We could locate him in the census, but not as Richard Etheridge, because as a slave, there was a separate slave schedule. Because we knew he's buried up at the aquarium, because we knew his birth date, we could identify him, but he was only listed by his gender and his age. So there weren't too many records. When he died, his wife filed a pension claim. And so there were those pension reports. And the daughter and son of his owner, so again, he is his master's son, they would have been his brother and sister. But these two people wrote in support of this pension claim. And they describe some of his upbringing. But again, it's this sort of colored by their memories and maybe also by an agenda, who knows? So there was just very little information, which is why we could only do so much in Fire on the Beach, which is also why I didn't know forever that I was going to write a novel about Richard Etheridge, but it was also intriguing because I didn't know how to get at some of the complicated, what struck me as complicated questions just from the record. he becomes much more present in the record after the war, though. A large part because of the Coast Guard, you know, the life-saving service. Yeah.
I volunteer down at the Island Visitor Center.
Hmm.
And the picture is on Fire on the Beach, hangs on one of the walls.
Yeah.
And there's also a poster that is there, and a postcard and some other things, but it prompts questions from visitors. We get visitors from all over the world. When the right birds are there, we get
Yeah.
other birds to describe some of them, but I get asked about it. Who is that? What is that? I know more now from what I've read that you've written, but from your perspective, if you were on the other side of the counter where I am and someone asks that question, what would you want them to take away? This is a brief encounter, so you can make the answer as long as you want.
Yeah, you need a couple of words.
But you've been inside this man in many ways that I certainly haven't, and I'm never going to do what you've done, but I'm intrigued by what you say. What would you want them to walk out with?
Two things. You know, if I were in your shoes, the thing that I think I would say a coastal hero and mention the Newman, right? Because the Newman rescue is just extraordinary, right? And the details of Newman rescue are just extraordinary. So I would mention the Newman, but the other thing that's pretty awesome. So, Bill Charles Bowser, Mr. Bowser was alive when we first started doing research, and he came down with us. This would have been in '93 or probably the summer of '94. But he came down with us several times. And one time he was going to show us where the station was. And the station was right across from where you are. You can have them walk over the dune, and that's where the station was. And it's not true anymore, because I haven't been out there in a long time. But it wasn't true a few years after this, we went down in '94. But in '94, part of the foundation, I think, of the ramp was still visible and the same. So you could actually point them to go up across the street, watch your traffic, cross over the dune. That's where the station was. And they performed this heroic rescue in 1896, where they saved all these people aboard the U.S. Navy. And I don't know, maybe if we're lucky, the beach will shift and those bits of foundation will reemerge. Yeah. Also, you could say, great book, By Fire on the Beach.
Like I certainly will, and I appreciate that.
So how much research went into Black Cloud Rising? When you have it, you got the fire
Yeah.
on the beach, but it's a novel,
Yeah.
but there's not a lot of
Yeah.
stuff there. Where did you find the thread?
The research for Fire on the Beach was the point of departure. And there was a lot, I mean, you know, Fire on the Beach, when we originally envisioned it, we were thinking this book that was going to be sort of comprehensive, sort of from the beginning of the P Island Station until it's decommissioned after the Second World War. So there was just a lot of stuff there that just doesn't make its way into Fire on the Beach. Some of it even during Richard Etheridge's time. We were going with a smaller sort of academic press at first, and we had more leeway at that point. But when people kept going, this would make a great trade book or whatever, and when we went with the trade book, it just needed to be more focused in a certain way. But we had done that research. In that research, so one of the blanks, not completely blank, but one of the spaces that were a little, it was just a little under, there wasn't a whole lot there, was about this 3-week episode. I stumbled on a book, I don't remember where, but it was a self-published book by a man named Jerry Vitt, V-I-T-T, and it described this 3-week raid. And to me, it was just completely fascinating. But that was pretty much the only source. I looked in his notes and it referred me to a New York Times article, and so I went to that. Tewksbury, who was an actual figure. Which is why, we included that chapter in Fire on the Beach. It was like a 10-page chapter because it's basically a compression of Vitt. I give him credit. I didn't just fire this stuff. When I went back to it in 2016, a few other things had been written that were really helpful. So there was a person who was doing either a master's thesis or a PhD on the 36th, on Richard's regiment. I'd seen a part of that when we were doing Fire on the Beach, but he was just working on it. By the time I come back to it, he's published it as a book. So it's useful just on the face of it. There are these letters from Alonzo Draper. There's stuff about Wilde that I did not know. And I can also then go to his sources, look at his bibliography and go to his sources. That was hugely helpful, particularly with Draper. There were a couple of, Draper was from his family too. There were a couple of books about Draper. There was also a book about the raid, because that raid was sort of dramatic in Elizabeth City. In fact, case in point about how dramatic it was. This is digressing. When Zoe and I had Fire on the Beach comes out, and we're on book tour or whatever, we're in Virginia Beach at the Life Saving Museum there, and it was a beautiful day. And we were outside, and there was nobody coming up for us. They didn't want us to sign a book, they didn't want to buy a book, they just wanted to be on the beach and have fun. And so we were sitting there, Zoe and I were sitting there, and the director of the Life Saving Museum comes out with like a cooler of beer. He's like, guys, I'm really sorry. And so we're sipping on a beer and we're sort of sitting there enjoying the sun too. And then like in the distance, we see a man looking at us. And look, as he's approaching, he had Fire on the Beach under his arm. So we're like, one person finally. So as he's coming up, we're like, hey, would you like for us to sign your book? And he flung it at us. He was like, that's the last thing I want. He's like, you can have your book. And he was mad about that 10-page chapter. He was like, the black troopers went down there and they did this and they that. I mean, it was contentious, right? These black troopers coming back down into where many of them had been enslaved, and apparently 100 some odd years later, it remained contentious. And so this book, the second book I was going to I'm referring to, was about that. It's called, I think it's called The Hanging of Daniel Wright, right? And that was hugely helpful. Again, the history of it, I understood the basic history, but it opens it up some. But especially useful are the notes and the bibliography, because then I can go to those sources and I can find very specific details. And that really helped me. Again, I could imagine the story without it, but it helped me color it in, really. Yeah. And he missed with the book. I don't think he was aiming. But,
Any other questions,
Yeah. Other questions I can answer?
This is not really book related, but have you met any of Richard Etheridge's descendants?
I have never been able to find it. I am sure there are.
Oh, there are Etheridge's.
Well, I mean, not the white
Yeah.
Etheridges, but the black Etheridges. Like he had 2 daughters. One died relatively young, if I remember correctly, and the other one we imagined she married, and we hoped that we would be able to sort of in that way. I mean, this is in 1994, 5, 6, so before 23andMe and all that. And I haven't tried beyond that. But at that point, we were told about a woman who was from Illinois who believed that she was related to him. But I remember having a phone conversation with her. She didn't know for sure. And as we were having a conversation, I didn't get the impression that she was. I don't remember her name now. But maybe she, again, this is before 23. Do you remember one?
Yeah, Frida Bailey Murray.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And I maybe I should call her now. Now we have 23andMe and but no, so no. I mean, everybody else, Midget Spouses, everybody else, but Richard Etheridge, no. Any final questions before?
Before you start saying one.
Yeah.
What was white ancestry? Did you investigate any of that? Did you talk with anyone?
Well, Patrick Etheridge, famous Captain Pat,
Right.
would have been his cousin, right? And I remember speaking with Mr. Wilson, and the white Etheridges didn't know so much, but that wasn't surprising to me because of the taboo nature of it. In the Black community, again, as a biracial person, some of the language I was reading when I was reading the pension file, for instance, it just rang a bell with language that I heard all my life. The taboo nature of so-called miscegenation in the Black community was just life, whereas in the white community it was more taboo, less talked about. And because we couldn't prove it, we talk about it speculatively, but we don't know for sure. But I remember talking to, I'm drawing a blank on his name now, Mr. Wilson, who was descended from Patrick Etheridge, and he was super curious. But I don't know how he received it. I do remember when Fire on the Beach came out. We were in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. I keep pointing out as though Massachusetts. And we were speaking to a really big room. And Zoe and I were, and we were talking about the fire, because Patrick Etheridge is the person who burned Piano Station down. And a woman came up afterwards, and she was a descendant of Etheridge too, but she lived up there. And I remember her reception, she was so surprised, curious, wanted to know more. But again, all I could do was point to the things that seemed to suggest it to us, you know, as researchers. So.
Do you think now that vegan is more prevalent with the 23andMe, do you think that they will try it? And but what would they?
I wonder, I never thought, I mean, I think it would be wonderful. I mean, for me, my curiosity would be, you know, piqued, but I don't know, you know. I think that would be wonderful. The only danger is that it might be part of farm and beach fishing then. There's up and down, two pieces of fishing then. But yeah, no, I'd be really curious. I'm always curious, and you know, this is part of the reason for the essay that I read from. Again, for me, that's what Americanness is. Americanness is mixedness. It just is. We resist it, even today, but that's what it is. And so I feel like when it doesn't feel taboo anymore is when we will have made bigger steps. You know, the steps we've made of late. I'm going into politics now, so it's like 2 steps forward and then a few steps back. Maybe it's 1 step or 2, I don't know. But I want us as a country to sort of embrace it more than just sort of quietly acknowledge it sometimes. You know what I mean? So I hope not.
Well, it's hard to see why everyone's so resistant to that idea, because if you look at mixed breeding animals, sometimes they're as strong as well.
My biology teacher in high school would say, you know, we would do those, remember those little squares where you do it, and she would be like, you know, it's mixing strains and breeds that, you know, the stronger genes. I mean, I was not doing biology in high school, so you can imagine 40 years later, what I'm saying here is probably not very biological, but she would say that exact thing, you know, that strength comes from hybridity, right? And we are hybrid, we're a hybrid nation. I think, that's my.
Will you let me know when that essay is published so that we can share it?
I will.
On
Yeah.
social media, make sure everybody gets to read it.
I would, yeah, I will, and if I'm lucky, I should know so. So I will for sure. Thank you. And thank you all.
This is going to help with personalization.